Hello, my name is Thomas. Welcome to British Culture. Albion never dies. Today I'm talking about Brits in the desert, my family in Kuwait, 1978. Why am I talking about this? Well, a huge amount of this channel is drawing on my experience both at home in the UK and overseas. After all, the guiding question of this podcast is, what is Britishness? So I like to have an international perspective with guests from overseas, Brits at home and abroad, and I often get messages about this, like, why have you lived abroad in the past? And my answer normally is, my parents started it. The first time I lived overseas is when I was a baby and a toddler in Berlin, and later on as a teenager in Turkish Cyprus. I just moved with my parents. In fact, most days of the week these days I get some lovely messages from people all over the world. So I just want to say a quick hello to David in New Mexico, Liam in California, Charlotte, Mark in the UK, and Izzy over in Denmark. Just hello to all of you. I wasn't the first member of my family to live overseas, far from it. But I do occasionally have people dissatisfied with my answer that I live abroad because my parents lived abroad. They say, well, okay, but why did your parents live abroad? So I thought in this episode I'd talk about one formative experience for my parents of overseas living, which was their time in Kuwait, 1978 to 1981. This was not their first time overseas, not even their first time living overseas together. They lived in Germany, but it was an impactful time, and one they often both talked about as I was growing up. Germany, where they'd lived before, was more familiar. There was a much larger British Army contingent, and my mother had a German pen friend since she was a teenager. In fact, they'd become lifelong friends. I met her pen friend, her husband and children on quite a few occasions and stayed with them. Kuwait, meanwhile, was a much smaller British team, and Kuwaiti culture is of course very different from what my mother was familiar with. My dad had lived in Egypt and Yemen as a child, again in British Army camps, but with ample opportunity to observe and interact with the local culture. Again, a bit more of a family history of living overseas. One of my overseas experiences that I haven't often talked about was my time in Saudi Arabia. It was one of my early jobs. I was teaching English to the most conservative Islamic clerics in Saudi Arabia. These were the men who trained the religious police, the Matawa. I only spent 6 months there. It was a relatively short time in terms of duration, but again, it was highly impactful. I think I experienced more in 6 months than I've experienced in years elsewhere. In fact, I was only expected to be there for, say, 6 weeks. I took over a 6-week course partway through, which had 2 previous teachers. So one had left after a week and another after a few weeks. So I finished that course, then I rolled on to the next and the next and the next and the next. It was, as I say, an intensive experience. I was in an all-Arab company, an all-Arab housing area, and it actually took me a little while to find the expat community. But at this time my parents were very happily living in next door, Oman. The Sultanate of Oman is a very different country. It's a place where they were both very happy and would in fact live for 6 years in total. I would also work there, again for about 6 months, but I'd fly in and out pretty often over the 6 years that my parents lived there. So at this time when I was in Saudi and they were in Oman, I asked my parents what it was like the first time they went to Kuwait. Saudi was my first time being immersed in, say, Arab culture, and Kuwait was their first time being immersed in a really different culture. As I say, by the time that I was teaching in Saudi, my parents were seasoned expats, but I was really interested in their first truly foreign experience. Again, Germany just doesn't really count. Now, I asked them this, I think in a Skype call or on telephone, and I got a fairly glib answer after all. I was asking them about their thoughts, their feelings and impressions of an experience more than 30 years before. But later in the week, my mother sent me an email after much reflection, and this is the email. I have been trying to recall details of our time in Kuwait. I know I did not want to return to the UK at the end of our tour. Dad turned down extending his time there principally because it was so stressful in a variety of ways, not least physically for me, it being so hot and my having to take the boys, my 2 older brothers, out a lot and therefore spending so much time in the heat. I had doubts about going there in the first place, but it gave us a variety of experience we were pleased to have had. We also saved enough money to put down a third of the price of a home we bought in Wokingham. I was very grateful for that. We were in Osnabrück towards the end of the 2-year tour there, with Dad as EME to the 5th Inniskillen Dragoon Guards. EME being, electrician, mechanical engineer. He was in the Royal Electricians and Mechanical Engineers. When he received a signal asking him to express interest in being put forward for the loan service job in Kuwait. He came home in very high spirits, and I was thrilled at the prospect of a sunshine posting, in addition to it being a very high-value posting in career terms. Dad had to be interviewed by General Sir John Stanier, who was to confirm Dad's suitability for loan service. REME postings had to put Dad's service details to Kuwaitis. We would not be departing for 15 months, and Dad had to do a 3-month Arabic course at the Army Language School at Beaconsfield. The Kuwait Defence Ministry also had to write the contract, a lengthy business. I sometimes had my doubts as to whether we would ever get there. We had just been invited to dinner whilst in Kuwait to meet a warrant officer and his wife who had just returned from Kuwait. They lived in IBI camp 30 miles from Kuwait City, the enclosed sergeant's patch of wooden hut homes with a communal swimming pool by the beach next to an oil facility, a compound really. The warrant officer's wife had clearly loved every minute in Kuwait and was sure we would too. She sported an amazing array of solid gold jewellery, which I thought vulgar at the time. They told us we should try to be housed in the Mazouk Pearl, a highly desirable complex of luxury 2-storey apartments adjacent to the sea with swimming pool in the centre and a beach where some officers kept their own boats. We were told there were shops on the ground floor where European products were sold. It was where the majority of the Kuwait Liaison Team, KLT, officers lived, and there was a waiting list for places there. I realised that if we had a top apartment, we'd be on the 8th and 9th floor, with open, to the outside, corridors from the lift to our front door. I did not really fancy that, with 2 very boisterous, adventurous small boys who were keen on climbing walls and hanging over them. Dad did not care to be living amongst the other KLT personnel. We were told that on first arrival we would be given a temporary place until better accommodation came available. Dad left for Kuwait in November, leaving us to follow about 3 weeks later. When we landed in Kuwait, Dad met us, wearing Kuwait Army uniform, and was therefore allowed to come right to the steps of the plane to meet us. What I noticed, even before Dad, was how differently the air smelled. He took us to his newly acquired Buick Sentry, a large American sports saloon in navy with a white leather roof. Despite having firmly told Dad that I did not want an American car, I desired a Jaguar, the moment I sat in the car I loved it. The boys could not believe their eyes when they saw its size. So different from our Mini in England, and Dad drove us to our villa. We found we had the ground floor of the house, which had been divided into 2 apartments. It belonged to a Kuwaiti who was now a military attaché in London and had let it out to the KLT. We approached a pair of tree-shaded yellow gates set in high white walls, and the accommodation was very spacious. It was several miles from any other family in the KLT, and indeed any other European or American families. It was months until we could get the phone connected. Dad only managed it then because he was a genius for managing the locals. I did eventually have my own car. We were often asked to events at the British Embassy. Dad was spoken to by the Duke of Edinburgh when the Duke and the Queen did a walkabout in the Embassy Gardens to which we were invited. Dad had dined with him about 6 months before, and the Duke had an excellent memory for faces. He recognised Dad, and they chatted for some time. I soon took a job at the Embassy of Japan to give me more dimensions to life, and this led to invitations to more garden parties. This is a minuscule record of my experiences in Kuwait, and it does not even cover the first 6 months. This was the letter my mother sent to me from Oman to me when I was working in Saudi Arabia. And my reflections on it was how interesting that the good stays and the struggles fade. Such is nostalgia. Such is memory. Plenty of people who've never lived abroad experience the exact same thing, hence old people everywhere talk about the good old days, which might not have been so well thought of when they're actually going through it. This is partly why I was so interested lately to read my contemporary account of my arrival in China in 2015, and then contrast it to a reflective piece I wrote in 2021 when I was leaving China, the end of my 6 years there. And of course I shared my current thoughts on the matter, and that was my April the 1st, 2025 episode, The Middle Kingdom Never Dies. Also my audio diaries of Turkish Cyprus that I shared on 1st of October 2024. There I was sharing about my thoughts, I think 18 years before, and then adding in my current reflections. I find that particularly interesting. And lately I've been going through, well, my parents' documents. My mother passed away last year, and so I've been going through a lot of diaries, photographs, cinefilms. Some of the cinefilms and photographs I've been digitizing so I can show them to my dad and get his recollections of them. And I found letters that my mother wrote to her parents. She wrote these letters whilst in Kuwait to her parents in England, and of course when they passed away the letters returned to my mother, and she passed away the letters have come to me. Now, unlike my father's parents, my mother's parents had very, very little experience of life overseas, and certainly nothing outside Europe. In fact, my maternal grandmother, I think her experience of overseas was pretty much a short time in Germany at the end of the war. So I was fascinated to go through these letters. As I say, they're explaining life overseas to Brits who have not experienced it. On Friday, the 8th of December, 1978, my mother flew to Kuwait with my two brothers, who were then aged 5 and 2 3/4. She wrote a letter to her parents on the following Monday. This is the letter. Dearest Mummy and Daddy, we had an amazingly good flight. In spite of the journey being delayed by an hour and a half, the chief stewardess made herself my personal nanny and cared for us so well. Reading the letter, I'm actually very impressed. The chief stewardess persuaded my mother not only to go to the Jumbo's lounge, but also into the cockpit to talk to the pilots. My mother was never very keen on flying, despite the evidence of her taking many flights in her lifetime suggesting the contrary. She didn't like flying, but she put up with it. Mother rated the Kuwaiti Airlines first-class food as, quote, only a little less delicious than that at the Royal Roof and countless courses. This was followed by lemon teas. The Royal Roof is a rooftop restaurant at a hotel that overlooks one of London's great parks. Anyway, before the flight, we were handed carnations, in-flight booties, and hot, scented flannels for refreshments and glasses of fruit juice. The hot, scented flannels were also brought round after lunch ended. There followed a movie which was quite boring. The sunset was really worth seeing there. Several young Arab men entertained and ragged the boys in the Jumbo's lounge, one doing conjuring tricks. We left the plane laden with presents from the aircrew. Frank met us and escorted us through immigration and customs so our bags were not searched. Just as well as they had, whoops, what a giveaway, in them. Kuwait is of course a dry country, dry meaning alcohol is forbidden. So we can guess what was inside my mother's bags. The temperature was in the high 70s, having been in the 80s during the day. Obviously, this is Fahrenheit. Britain had changed to Celsius by this time, but my mother and my father had grown up with Fahrenheit being the norm. She continues, the two boys and I were all impressed by our 5.5-litre Buick. Navy, with white roof and seats. It seems large to us, but equates to an MGB GT in the States, being a 4-seater sports car. It certainly is comfortable and the air conditioning is overpowering. I could not begin to describe driving standards in Kuwait. You just would not believe the smashed up cars and incidents I have seen in the last 3 days. There is no problem about keeping the boys in their seatbelts though. Both were quick to see the good sense in wearing them and remind us if we forget. Saturday, Frank drove us down to the sea in the morning, and we all walked around the souks in the evening. That was when we brought my bangle and the boys some canvas shoes. The sand was ruining their shoes. Sunday morning, I spent the morning washing a mountain of clothes, and by the time Frank came home from work at 2 p.m, I felt ghastly. He explained that it was not surprising since the temperature was 86 degrees and the humidity high. However, when the shops opened after siesta, we went to the Indian store in Al Samia and bought me the latest Indesit, which is an Italian washing machine. It should arrive tomorrow. Today I took things more gently and feel fine. This morning Ahmed, the caretaker, cleaned and filled the pool for the boys. Ahmed lives in a tiny bungalow in the yard next to the villa and is retained by the owner. He waters the trees, etc. The pool is a tiled, star-shaped one and big enough for a child to swim in. This evening we went to the nearest co-op, a state-subsidised supermarket, and bought food. We live between the districts of Al Samir and Rumathia. It is less European than the Pearl Flats, but having visited the flats, I think I prefer being where we are. At the moment, I am confined with the children to the house and garden all the time Frank is away, but once I have a car of my own, and my local licence, I can go out to the beach club and Al Samir shops. My upstairs neighbour, an Italian married to an RAF officer, works during the morning running a kindergarten. Unfortunately, 2 of the wives work and 2 others have had babies in the last month, so there's no one to show me around at the moment. But there are a few social events coming up, so I expect someone will volunteer to rescue me from Purda. It certainly is different. The tour promises to be interesting and I love the weather, as do we all. It is such fun picking lemons off a tree to put into my tea. Have a good Christmas. Unfortunately, our boxes do not come until after the holiday. Much love, Lee. Well, my reflections reading this letter is first of all the taste of the high life. First class, Kuwaiti Airlines, and of course the Middle Eastern Airlines at this time and continuing for some time afterwards were prestige airlines. And certainly to have British Army officers' wife flying with them, they were given all the star treatment. In my time in the Middle East, I was flown around by a couple of companies first class on the local carriers, and they were magnificent. It was my first taste of the high life as well. The highs were very, very high. The lows, later on, would be desperately low in order to compensate, I assume. The roads of the Middle East, of course, were described by my mother as crazy, but the roads themselves were long, wide and flat. In many ways like roads in California in the United States. What's different, of course, is the driving. And the fact that Western shoes do get carved up by the desert pretty quickly. Solved for my older brothers with canvas shoes. Desert boots don't actually work out in the desert. In fact, there is a story of a British Army officer being sent out to the Middle East who bought some some desert boots from Chelsea Street, and, well, they got torn up. He was outraged how quickly they got torn up just within a few weeks out there, so he phoned his wife and said, "Have you got the box? Have you still got the receipt?" So when he came back after a short tour, he took these carved up boots with the box and receipt and was asked, "Where have you been wearing them?" He said, "Well, I've been wearing the desert boots in the desert." And they said, "Oh no, you shouldn't be wearing desert boots in the desert," and refused to give him his money back. The final thing about my mother's letter that intrigues me is she was aware that expats would be a supportive community, right? So it's a very small community, especially at this time, out in Kuwait. It's a very, very small community, and it is necessarily supportive, and sometimes not so supportive, a bit like moving to a tiny, remote village. Now, I've commented already on my parents having different upbringings. My mother's upbringing was very, very much in the UK, in Hampton Court, for example, whilst my father, he was born in Malaya and then spent his childhood years in Aden, now Yemen, Egypt, Cyprus, as well as stays in the UK. His father was born in Uttar Pradesh, India, and his childhood was spent in various parts of India and some now Pakistan and Hong Kong. I do have a recollection that my paternal grandfather, first came to the UK at the age of 13, but I can't be entirely sure of that. He didn't talk about the past very much. He certainly did say, "I'd fight for England, die for England if need be, but sure as hell never live there." And he certainly stayed with that. He spent his retirement years in Spain, passing away there, as good as his word. So, it's interesting, my father, as somebody very, very used to living abroad, wrote a letter to my mother's parents, 1st of December 1978, talking to them about their arrival in Kuwait. He writes, "Dear Mother and Father, I was sorry not to be able to come down to Swindon before flying out here, but I didn't fully realise how busy I would be after they cut my leave from a fortnight to a week. Typical army. I'm afraid there just wasn't time. As Lee has no doubt told you, I had an uneventful flight out via Cairo. I was a little disappointed that transit passengers weren't allowed out of the plane at Cairo, and I had to sit in it for 1.5 hours whilst they refuelled it, but I suppose I'd only have the airport buildings anyway, and they probably haven't changed much since the days I flew back from Aden via there. That would have been the early 1960s. We have been quite lucky with our quarter. It's really a senior officer's quarter and consists of a large villa which has been divided into 2 flats, an up and a down. We have the ground floor portion, which is the larger of the 2, and the rooms are really vast with high decorated ceilings and even a glass chandelier in the main drawing room. The whole thing is set in a fair-sized garden surrounded by a big wall, so it is the perfect place for children to play. We even have a gardener/caretaker paid for by the owner. As most people are in large blocks of flats, I feel we've been very lucky to draw this place. I'm working out at a camp called Jahra, which is right out in the desert, and I'm faced with a drive of 3/4 of an hour each way, every day through what must be the worst driving conditions known to man. Every Arab seems to rely on the will of Allah and a bit of horn tooting to see him to his destination, rather than reliance on basic driving skills. It is impossible to fully describe it, but 2 instances I've observed will give you some of the flavour. The first was seeing a standard forklift truck chugging along quite happily at about 7 miles an hour in the outside lane of a 3-lane highway. The other was sitting at a set of red lights when a truck inside me decided to go through the lights and turn left across my bows. Lane discipline is unknown here, and everyone will aim themselves at any bit of road that is free, or failing that, the pavement or desert alongside of the road. The North Circular Road can be bad on occasions, but it is never like this. I'm finding the weather comfortable in the low 60s, and there's been 1 day of rain since my arrival. Those who've been through a summer here, though, are finding it chilly and are donning pullovers. We get next to no news of UK affairs. The English language paper, as well as having lovely misprints and bloomers, concentrates largely on local Arab affairs. And the English news on the radio once a day is a joke. Over half of it goes something like, His Excellency, the Emir al-Sabah al-Jabbar al-etc. etc. sent his congratulations to President Mahmoud al-etc. etc., the President of Tunisia, on the occasion of Tunisia's National Day. In fact, it's a long court circular with 1 or 2 items of world news thrown in at the end. Once we get settled in, however, I'll get busy with the dials and see if I can come up with a BBC World Service. I hope you are both well. Please pass my regards to Peter next time you see them, my uncle. And please tell Peter that the Arabs would appreciate his driving here, but surpass it with ease. Love, Frank. I love the focus again, the 3rd time, on driving overseas. Yes, when I was in Saudi Arabia, I saw a great deal of traffic that I would never see anywhere else. One of them, when I was on a 6-lane super highway, I saw an ambulance reverse across all the lanes of traffic, and I saw a Hummer flip over. The driver was attempting to do a U-turn over the central reservation. I'm sure you're familiar with how wide the wheelbase is of a Hummer. So yes, driving in some parts of the Middle East can be quite incredible and quite memorable. In fact, I once drove past the Saudi card graveyard, which my parents did in Kuwait, and it was truly impressive. My father in his letter also refers to acclimatising. When you first fly out to a hot country, regardless of the time of year, well, you perhaps hope to be in shorts and certainly be in short sleeves, but after a year there, pretty much you're wearing the same clothes as you might anywhere else. Or certainly, in winter you'll be wearing a pullover. Everywhere has an evening cooler than the midday. Well, everywhere that I've been. And it's just an interesting insight into acclimatising. I can recall after years abroad, I happened to be in the UK when my parents were visiting, and both of us were walking down a UK street on a hot sunny day. So hot and sunny, there were Brits walking along shirtless, whilst I was wearing a jumper and a jacket, and so were my parents, because we were used to a very different type of winter. I also like my father's reference to the local news stations. When I was first out in the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, the local news really wasn't very, very different, and it was all obsessively about what was happening in the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, and occasionally what other countries had stated about the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. I've enjoyed going through all these letters. These are just the first 3, because I really wanted to capture those first impressions and recollections of those first impressions. As I say, I've been going through cinefilms, I've been going through slides, I've been going through photographs, showing them to my dad and getting his recollections. I hope that you enjoyed this episode. As I say, I've been enjoying going through it, and I'll carry on going through these letters if you want me to. As I say, it's been an absolute delight to be getting these messages all throughout, well, most days this week. And again, if you're wanting more information, or if you're wanting to see some of these pictures and cinefilms and so on, the videos are, I believe, already on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/British Culture. But a lot of material will be going on my website, albionneverdies.com. And if you'd like to send me a message on Instagram, and Fleming Never Dies, and my email is albionneverdies@gmail.com. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it.